Are you ready for a bedtime story?
Alan and Matt were ghost hunters. They would visit old cemeteries and see if they could stir up a spirit from an old tombstone. They set up their recorder on a particularly large and ornate headstone and prepared to begin. They were afraid to shine their flashlights on the stone to see the name engraved there, as trespassing in the cemetery at night was illegal. They had crawled over the fence at the rear of the cemetery to avoid the caretaker. Matt flipped the on button on the recorder and said aloud, "We would like to speak to whoever lies beneath this stone." In response, all they heard was a scratching noise that seemed to come from behind the tombstone. With a calm voice, Alan said, "Please, tell us your name." Again, the only response was a scratching noise, so Matt said, "We only wish to speak with you. Please, show yourself." Suddenly, both young men felt the air turn cold and a tall, dark shadow rose from behind the tombstone. The shadow moved to engulf them. Alan and Matt had many encounters with spirits and were not afraid. Too late, though. They both realized the apparition meant them harm. The shadow swept down, engulfing them, and pulled them into the ground beneath the tombstone. The next morning, the caretaker of the cemetery found the recorder on the ground by the tombstone. He turned it on, and after each question, he heard the following response.
"Yes, I am here. My name is never spoken by the living. If I show myself, it will be the last thing you will ever see. I have you both."
The caretaker quickly picked up the recorder, knowing he had the only evidence that someone had been in the cemetery and by that tombstone. He went to his tool shed and tossed the recorder into a pile with many other recorders. Two young girls, Maddie and Sue, were best friends who spent a great deal of time together. Maddie was spending the night at Sue's house when they decided to tell ghost stories. Maddie told a story she heard from her older brother about how, if you stabbed a knife into a grave, the person buried there will reach out and grab you and pull you into the grave. Sue did not believe the story. Maddie agreed, but said she was afraid to try it, even if it was just a story. Sue exclaimed, "I am not afraid. I would try it." Maddie called Sue's bluff, daring her to go to the cemetery down the road and prove that she was not afraid. Both girls went to the kitchen downstairs where they found a flashlight and a knife. Maddie decided her dare was silly and begged Sue not to go. But Sue wanted to prove the story was a hoax and that she was not afraid. Off she went into the dark night. Maddie sat at the kitchen table waiting for her friend. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, after 30 minutes, Maddie ran to her parents' bedroom, woke them up, and told them what had happened. She cried in her mother's arms as her father grabbed a flashlight and headed towards the cemetery. When he returned, he was pale and shaken. In a solemn voice, he told Maddie and her mother what he had found. There on the grave was Sue, dead with completely white hair. The police were called, and after listening to Maddie's explanation of why Sue was in the graveyard, the investigation determined that the death was accidental. When Sue stabbed the knife into the grave, it went through the hem of her nightgown. Thinking she had been grabbed by the person buried there, she died of fright. There was a wealthy farmer who owned a lot of land in Ohio. He built a new barn on his property every time his wife had a baby. He named the barns after each of his children, and by the time this story takes place, they had 6 kids and were expecting number 7. However, the farmer's wife died in childbirth, and so did her unborn baby. The farmer went insane with grief and couldn't tend to his farm. The family had no money and the farm started going under. They say that one night, in the depths of his madness and despair, the farmer took an axe and led his children out to the barns where he murdered them, one by one. He buried each of their bodies in the 6 barns that had been named after them. Then, the farmer went to the 7th barn, where he hung himself. As the story goes, all the barns were eventually torn down and the land was sold off, all except for the 7th barn. Nobody wanted to buy the land because of what had happened there, so it was abandoned and soon fell into disrepair. They say if you go to that barn at night, you can see the ghost of the farmer hanging from the rafters, his body swinging back and forth in the wind, dwelling on his terrible crime for all eternity. No one was ever really sure where the 7th barn was located, although it was definitely in Ohio. In 1997, a local Ohio teacher claimed that after a lot of research, he had finally managed to track down the real location of the infamous 7th barn. He said that none of the barns had ever actually been torn down. The land had just been divided up and sold off, and the barns had simply been incorporated into neighboring farms. According to the teacher, he was able to pinpoint the correct location because all of the barns on neighboring properties had nameplates above their doors with the names of children engraved on them. The teacher and his son set out at night to visit the barn, bringing a video camera with them in the hopes of capturing some paranormal activity. The next morning, the teacher's wife reported her husband and son missing. Police found their abandoned car by the roadside. While searching the area, they entered a barn in a nearby field and found the dead bodies of the teacher and his son hanging from the rafters.